Chapter 1. Cissie Rivers felt a pang as she watched her best friend, Cindy, with her new husband, Trey. Every time she saw them together, she realized she was missing something. She had contacted Lachele Simpson, the matchmaker responsible for Cindy's marriage, and was playing the waiting game. She knew her man was out there somewhere. She just hoped he was half as good a husband to her as Trey was to Cindy. The problem with using Lachele and her company, Matchrimony, to find a man was she wouldn't get to see him until she was walking down the aisle. She wouldn't know his name or anything about him until they were legally wed. It was hard to give someone that much control over your life, especially when you liked to control things yourself, but she knew Lachele had done a good job for Cindy. On one hand, she felt guilty for being jealous of Cindy, but on the other, she realized that it wasn't her husband she was jealous of, but the relationship itself. She wanted more than what she had. That was always Cissie's problem. She always wanted more. She wanted the whole world spread out before her, and here she was, sitting in the middle of Blevins, Wisconsin, in the bowling alley she managed. There had to be more to life than this. Once, she'd thought she could conquer the world with her singing, but instead she'd just ended up back in Blevins where she'd started from. She was manager of the bowling alley her parents owned, where she bowled her first strike, waited her first table, and received her first paycheck. Now the only singing she did was during Wednesday night karaoke. She looked back at the list of songs, feeling discontented with all of them. She always kicked off karaoke night, but she just didn't feel like singing. She pushed the songbook away. "I don't want to sing tonight." And for Cissie, that was saying a lot. She always wanted to sing. She sang in the kitchen, the shower, and while she did paperwork. Not feeling like singing was tantamount to saying she was dying. Cindy jerked her eyes away from Trey's face and stared at Cissie as if she'd just grown 2 heads. "What did you just say? Are you sick?" Cissie sighed. "You know, even I don't feel like singing every night." How could she sing when she felt like her life was being wasted? She was going to be alone forever. But, Cindy shook her head sadly. "You need to sing a butt-kicking song to feel better. Something that fits your mood." She pulled the book away from Cissie and started flipping through it quickly. "Here, this is the song you need to sing." She put her finger in the middle of the page and pushed the book toward Cissie. A slow smile spread across Cissie's face. "Yes, that's exactly what I need to sing. What would I do without you?" Cissie jumped up and marched to the karaoke hostess. She whispered in her ear, and the girl nodded, smiling. "You got it, boss lady." She sat down to work her magic, cueing the song. Stepping back up to the microphone, she announced, "To kick off our evening of fun, let's give a warm welcome to Cissie Rivers, manager here at Blevins Bowl, imploring you to take it like a man." Cissie grinned, feeling the music all the way inside her gut as it slowly filled up the room. Her hips started swaying to the beat as if of their own volition. Cindy was right, as always. This was the song she needed tonight. She belted out the words of the chorus, smiling at the cheers she heard from the other women in the bowling alley. She wasn't the only one feeling frustrated with men tonight. Her pure alto voice filled the alley. She knew she sounded her best, because she meant every word of the song that night. She really did need to find someone who could take her heart like a man. Asterisk. Sitting in the bowling alley at a table all alone, Bob grinned. He was the man who was going to take her heart, and he wanted to shout it from the rooftops. Lachele had called him that day to confirm what he already knew. He and Cissie were a perfect match. Cissie must not have heard yet, but their wedding was set for 2.5 weeks away. He rubbed his sweaty palms on the legs of his jeans. The woman made his heart beat faster when she swayed to the music on that little stage. He wished he could get up the courage to talk to her, but he hadn't been able to yet. He didn't think she'd even noticed him. Of course, he never dressed up when he came for karaoke, because he was always in a hurry to get there right after work. He showed up in his uniform and gazed at her, trying to disappear into the crowd. He didn't want her to notice him quite yet, but she filled the gaps in his soul with her songs. Never in his life had he been afraid to approach a woman. He knew how to treat a lady. He'd dated his fair share, and he'd even been engaged once. He was a deputy sheriff, and he had no time for shyness. But Cissie, every time he thought about talking to her, his heart was in his stomach, and his palms were sweating. His tongue felt like it grew to 3 times its normal size, and he knew he'd never be able to get a coherent word out. And he blushed. He was not a man who blushed, ever. But something about Cissie had him blushing like a schoolgirl on her first date. He was the youngest child with 4 older sisters, who had all lectured him from the time he was small on how to treat a lady. He knew he would make a good husband if only he could find a way to approach her. He looked over at his new friend Trey, thankful every day he'd met him. It had been a month since he'd first come to the Blevins Bowl for karaoke night. He'd been on a blind date, set up by a coworker. The girl had been pretty enough, and he'd brought her there, because it's what she'd wanted to do. The whole way there, she had regaled him with stories of how wonderfully she could sing. He'd been bored with her before they'd even reached their destination, and he knew he'd never ask her out again. Someone who talked about herself as much as she did had no place in Bob's life. They'd arrived minutes before the singing was supposed to start for the evening, and I had immediately been caught by a girl a few tables over. She was sitting with a man and 3 other women. She was across from the man, so he was certain they hadn't been together, which had pleased him. He didn't know if there was someone in her life, but he hoped there wasn't. She was his dream come true, which he would never have said to anyone. Cops didn't believe in love at first sight. She was a tall, lanky brunette with the greenest eyes he'd ever seen. When he'd first noticed her, her eyes had been filled with fire, like she'd wanted to hurt someone. He'd watched her carefully, and a few minutes later, she'd stood up and walked to the front. As soon as she started singing, he'd known he had to meet her. What he didn't know was how to make it happen. She was beautiful and special, and no matter how many times he'd tried, he hadn't been able to approach her. He'd come back without the girl he'd escorted the first night before attempting it, but by that time, he'd built her up so far in his mind, he hadn't been able to manage it. He'd been thrilled when he had a chance to talk to her best friend's husband, Trey. The man had explained she was in the process of getting a matchmaker to set her up with a man who she would meet at the altar. Bob had never had trouble getting a date, but he'd taken the information Trey gave him, contacting the matchmaker and explaining that he'd like to be matched to Cissie. It had taken 4 hours of conversation to convince the woman to even interview him to see if he would be suitable as a husband for the girl. Her initial response had been, "Good gravy, boy. That's not something I do." Still, it had worked out for him. Judging by the song she sang, she must not know yet though. Of course, what would she be singing if she knew? "I'm getting married in the morning from my fair lady?" He grinned as he thought about how she'd sound faking a Cockney accent for the song. Everything about her made him smile, and he was going to marry her. "What are you smiling so big about?" Trey asked. Bob grinned at his new friend and motioned with his head for him to sit. "I guess Cissie hasn't heard yet. Lachele is convinced I'm the perfect man for her." Trey was the first person he'd told, and saying the words aloud made them seem so much more real to him. Cissie was going to be his bride. Trey practically bounced up and down in his seat. "You have a date yet?" 2 weeks from Saturday. Dr. Lachele said she'd arrange for us to marry at the church here in town. She said it was the same one you married Cindy in. He was still trying to wrap his mind around the fact that it was actually happening. "When did you talk?" "Late this afternoon. I thought she'd decided we wouldn't work out." I was starting to panic a little. Bob shook his head. "I would have had to find a way to approach Cissie on my own, and I'm really not sure I could do that yet. I told you I'd introduce you. It would have been no big deal." I know, but every time I even thought about it, I panicked. What it is about Cissie, I don't know. I never believed in love at first sight, but I sure do now. His eyes were still on Cissie as she went back to the table where she sat with Cindy. Trey frowned. You've got it bad for her. I hope you know she's just a girl like everyone else. Oh, I know, but, well, she seems like so much more to me. How on earth are you going to talk to her after you're married if you can't even say hello now? Have you thought about that? Bob shrugged. She signed a contract to stay married for at least a year. Hopefully I'll work this out in that time. I mean, a year is a long time to blush and stammer like an idiot. Surely I'll be able to talk to her before then. I guess I can always write her notes if I have to. Trey chuckled. I can just picture that. All right. I wish you the best. Thanks. Bob watched as Trey wandered back to the table he was sharing with Cissie and Cindy. He took his wife's phone and left for a minute. As Bob did his best not to plug his ears as someone got up on stage and sang an off-key rendition of I Will Survive, he saw Cissie frown down at her phone, before looking at the caller ID. When her face lit up, and she jumped up from the table to run somewhere quiet, he had a feeling Trey had interfered, again. He said a silent prayer, thanking God for interfering friends. Asterisk. Cissie ran outside of the bowling alley where she knew it would be quiet, and her ears wouldn't bleed, before answering the phone. Hello? She knew it was Lachele. Please, 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 let it be good news. She couldn't handle watching Cindy and Trey for much longer. Hey, snickerdoodle. It's Lachele. Hi. Please tell me you have good news. Cissie closed her eyes, saying a quick prayer that Lachele had found her man. I have good news. I'll be calling you tomorrow with details, but I think we have you a match. Cissie felt tears fill her eyes, dashing them away quickly. Everyone thought she was so strong, so tough, but really she was just like everyone else. She needed to be loved more than anything, and she'd started to believe she'd be alone forever. Thank you. Lachele laughed. I hope you're still saying that after the wedding. I'm going to bring my new assistant for the wedding. You're going to love her. Sounds fine. Honestly, Cissie didn't care if Lachele brought her entire office staff, just so she could marry. Soon. I'll call tomorrow with all the details. Around 10 your time good? That way I'm not interrupting your work. Sounds great. I'll talk to you then. Cissie stared at the phone in her hand, suddenly wanting to sing another song. She didn't know what, but she was going to fill the bowling alley with a happy song. She was getting married. She ran through the songs in the book mentally. No, better than a happy song, she'd sing a song about what she was looking for in life. She'd sing, Somebody. Asterisk. Bob watched as the object of his affections rushed back into the bowling alley, hugging Cindy and Trey in turn. She said something to them, but Bob couldn't hear her over the caterwauling going on from the microphone. He watched as she walked to the karaoke hostess and talked to her again. The woman grinned and nodded. 2 songs later, and just a touch of blood from his left eardrum, Cissie stood behind the microphone while the hostess introduced her. And now, Cissie is going to grace us with one more song. The slim blonde waited for the cheering to die down before she said, here she is singing, Somebody. Cissie started to sway with the music, a song Bob didn't recognize. He listened carefully to the words about the man she wanted in her life, and he smiled. He knew he could be all that for Cissie. In fact, with as afraid as he was to speak around her, he knew it would be easy. At least at first it would. His heart ached for her when she sang that she wanted a man who would kiss her tenderly while she slept. He would do that for her. He would be her somebody. He sighed happily. There was no woman he'd ever cared for like he did that sweet-voiced woman, and he was going to make her happier than she'd ever dreamed of being. Asterisk. Cissie was ready to leave for work before Lachele called, because she wanted to give the matchmaker her full attention, rather than be running around finding a shirt while Lachele was talking to her. She sat at the table in her kitchen with a notebook and pen, ready to take note. Hopefully Lachele would let enough clues slip that she could figure out who her soon-to-be husband was. When the phone rang at exactly 10, Cissie snatched it up, her heart racing. "Talk to me." She'd been awake all night, dreaming of the man she'd marry. In her mind he was tall, dark, handsome, and faceless. She could not put a face on her mystery man, no matter how hard she tried. "Hey there, Cupcake. I found him." "Him? What's his name?" "That doesn't matter at all at this point, Cissie. Stop trying to figure it out." Lachele's voice was as sweet as ever, but firm as she refused to give out any information. "Wedding will be at the church where Cindy and Trey got married 2 weeks from Saturday." Cissie blinked a few times. "Only 2 weeks? That wasn't much time. I have to find a wedding dress." "Good gravy, girl. You should have started wedding dress shopping the minute you contacted me that you were ready." "What were you thinking?" Cissie sighed. "That you'd give me a little more notice? Your groom is extremely impatient. He's ready to marry you yesterday." "Sounds good to me. Will you be here for the wedding?" Cissie had only known Lachele for a year and a half, but she wanted her to be there. She wanted her to be there for her moral support, but also for her fun, quirky self. Even if Lachele hadn't been her matchmaker, she'd have wanted her there. "Of course, I'm going to be there. I told you last night I was bringing my new assistant to the wedding." Cissie closed her eyes for a moment. It was all happening so fast her head was spinning. "I wasn't sure if you were sending her in your place." "Oh, gosh, no. I might do that for a regular client in the future, but I like you too much to let you flounder. Samara and I will come out the day before the wedding and we'll all have our own little bachelorette party. Tell Cindy I've got it handled. We'll drive wherever we need to drive for a quiet dinner, and maybe a little bit of rip-roaring fun. You up for that?" Cissie smiled, a bit concerned about what Lachele would consider rip-roaring fun. Whatever it was, though, she'd do it. She was getting married. She wouldn't have trusted anyone else in the world to find her a man, but Lachele had done such a good job for Cindy. Surely she'd do just as well for her. Sounds wonderful. And it did. Better than wonderful. Cissie quickly called Cindy. "I need a wedding dress." Asterisk. 2 weeks wasn't much time to plan a wedding, but Cindy and Cissie made it work with a little help from Cissie's mother, who wasn't exactly on board with the idea, but didn't try to talk her daughter out of it. Lachele and her new assistant came with Cindy to the bowling alley at lunchtime on Friday. Cissie hadn't expected them to be there yet, so she squealed when she saw the crazy purple-haired matchmaker. "I suppose you're wanting a booby bump again." Lachele laughed, jumping up and throwing herself at Cissie, hugging her tightly. "I need you to meet my new assistant. She reads as much as the rest of us do. This is Samara Royal." Cissie smiled at the dark-haired girl sitting in the booth. "It's nice to meet you, Samara. I'm surprised anyone can work with this crazy woman day after day." Samara looked remarkably normal to work with Lachele. She wondered how long it would be before the pretty woman would be sporting pink streaks in her hair. Samara grinned. "Oh, it's a trial, but I do love my work." Lachele put her hands on her hips, glaring at her assistant. "She's helping me out with Matchrimony. I can't believe how fast the business is taking off now that I have that beautiful website Trey made for me." Cindy grinned. "My husband is talented." "Oh, quit bragging about your sex life, Cindy," Lachele said with a grin. "We were talking about his design skills." Cissie choked on a laugh as Cindy blushed. "Yeah, don't brag about your sex life, Cindy." She turned back to Lachele. "I plan on having a sex life soon too." Please tell me this guy isn't shy. I've waited my whole life to get married and pounce on a man, and I'm not putting it off. Since she'd been told her ideal man was found, she'd daydreamed a lot about what he would be like. And how her wedding night would go. Lachele laughed. He doesn't seem shy to me at all. Oh, good. What's his name? Cissie knew she wasn't allowed to ask, but she had to. She wanted to find this man and see what he was all about. Knowing nothing was going to make her crazy. You know I'm not telling you his name. Go put our food order in and behave yourself. I want my usual. Lachele laughed. Why do I have a usual at a bowling alley in the middle of nowhere, Wisconsin? I mean, really? This is my 4th trip in as many months. No one flies to Wisconsin that often, do they? Cissie laughed, turning to Samara. What do you want? She couldn't take offense at Lachele's comment about Wisconsin. She loved the place, but she knew it wasn't exactly the #1 tourist destination in the world. I have no idea. What do you recommend? Burger and fried cheese curds, Cindy, Cissie, and Lachele all said at the same time. Samara blinked for a moment. I guess I'll have a burger and fried cheese curds. She waited until Cissie had rushed off toward the kitchen before leaning forward to ask softly, what on earth is a fried cheese curd? Lachele patted Samara's shoulder. It's a tiny piece of deep-fried heaven. You'll love it. How long have you been working for Lachele? Cindy asked. Only about a month. It's a fascinating business. You wouldn't believe what goes into making a match. I don't know what goes into it, but I know whatever it is, it's worth it. My match was just right for me. Trey is an amazing husband. Cindy smiled, her face lighting up when she mentioned her husband. And a great lover too, I take it, Samara said with a grin. Cindy blushed. No comment. Lachele leaned forward to talk to Cindy. How's Cissie doing? Is she nervous? Cindy shook her head. It's amazing. She was getting mad at the world, and you called and said the wedding was happening, and suddenly she was the happiest woman alive. No nerves, just pure excitement. Lachele smiled. Great. He's going to be good for her. I hope so. She's a sweet, loving woman. She needs someone who can match her excitement about life. Asterisk. Bob had to pull a double shift on Friday to get the sheriff to agree to let him off for a week for his honeymoon. Not that he planned to go anywhere, but he wanted time off for assorted newlywed activities. Unfortunately, that meant he was on traffic duty that night. He hated Friday night traffic duty, because it always meant one thing. Drunk drivers. He still was having a hard time believing he was going to get to marry the girl of his dreams. He just hoped it didn't come back to bite him in the butt the way he'd gone about it. Truly, he knew he should have found some way to approach her, but hopefully she'd understand when she found out and let it slide. He was pulled off to the side of the road, his radar gun pointed toward the 2-lane highway between Shady Hills and Blevins. He saw a Yukon weaving from one lane to the other, and turned on his lights, pulling out behind it. Obviously a drunk driver. He hated traffic duty, but he told himself it was worth the honeymoon time as he pulled over to the side of the road behind the SUV. He had his hand on the gun at his side when he walked up beside the car. The woman had already rolled her window down. His eyes widened as he realized it was Lachele, and Cissie was in the back of the car. Holy cow! How was he supposed to do his job with Cissie looking at him from the back seat, her eyes wide, a huge grin on her face? She obviously thought it was amusing Lachele had been pulled over. Lachele jumped out of the truck, running around behind it with him. Normally, he'd have stopped her, but the situation was strange. When they reached the back of the vehicle, he frowned at her. Have you been drinking? He could think of no other reason for the woman to have been weaving in and out of the lanes as she was. Lachele laughed. Sure. I've had 4 Cokes with extra ice. Bachelorette parties make me thirsty. Bob frowned, looking toward the truck. People drink at bachelorette parties. What had they done? He hoped Cissie hadn't been forced into the type of debauched activities he'd read about happening at bachelorette parties. Not at this one. Really, we only had soft drinks. She shrugged as if she didn't care if he believed her. Are you willing to take a breathalyzer? He didn't want to give her a ticket. What if she told Cissie that she'd set everything up, and Cissie refused to marry him as a result? He didn't think she would do it, but he didn't really know her either. Yep. Of course, I am. I wouldn't drink and drive, Deputy Bob. Bob frowned. Deputy Bob? You make me sound like a bad cartoon character. He certainly hoped that name never caught on. Lachele's laugh filled up the night. Get the breathalyzer out so we can be on our merry way. You were driving recklessly, no matter what your intoxication level is. I don't want you driving any more tonight. Or with Cissie in your vehicle ever again. Oh, that? I was telling one of my stories, and I got to giggling, and then we were all laughing. I just swerved a little, and I didn't hit anyone. She shrugged. I haven't hit anyone in over a month. A month? Bob felt his eyelid twitching a bit. Do you hit people often? What had Cissie been thinking getting into a vehicle with this crazed woman? He was going to have to take her to task as soon as they married, and he was not looking forward to it. Oh yeah. They should have taken my license away years ago. Bob leaned over, trying to keep his voice down. You've got my future wife in that car. I want someone else driving. Now. He knew he was acting overbearing, and at that moment he didn't care. The woman he loved was in danger, and it needed to stop. Lachele sighed. Fine. We'll let Sammy Sunflower drive. She's better at it than me anyway. Who on earth is Sammy Sunflower? Why am I even asking this? He couldn't keep the exasperation out of his voice. He wanted to force this Sammy Sunflower to take a driving test before he would let her drive Cissie, but he knew that would look terribly suspicious. Oh, that's my nickname for my assistant, Samara. She was in the passenger seat. Do you want me to introduce you? It was all Bob could do not to reach out his hands and shake the woman. No, I don't need to meet her. Just give her the car keys. I thought you were going to give me a breathalyzer. Bob closed his eyes and counted to 10. Just give her the keys and drive away. I'll see you at the wedding tomorrow. Cissie was worth dealing with the eccentric matchmaker she'd chosen to marry them. Lachele smiled. Cissie is going to love you. I'll remind her after the wedding that you didn't give me a ticket. Bob just nodded as Lachele rushed away, giving her keys to a slender woman with dark hair, who waved at him as she ran around the car and got behind the steering wheel. I'll drive safe. I promise, she called back. Bob watched them drive off, hoping his bride was still in one piece for the wedding. He could just see her face all bruised and broken from hitting a tree. Lachele should not be allowed to drive on public roads. Ever. Asterisk. Cissie watched the exchange out the back window of the truck with a wistful expression on her face. I sure do love a man in uniform. And that one is sexy. She put her hand over her mouth. I guess I shouldn't say that since I'll be married tomorrow. Lachele turned around and grinned at Cissie. I have a feeling your future husband won't mind a bit. Cissie's eyes widened. What kind of man wouldn't mind if his wife was lusting after another man? You're not fixing me up with a gay man, are you? She needed a man interested in women. Lachele had to hold her sides as her guffaws filled the car. No, he's not gay, she choked out between peals of laughter. Cissie breathed a sigh of relief. It would be just her luck to marry a gay man. She wanted love, companionship, and sex. Was that too much to ask for? Asterisk. It was after 2 in the morning when Bob got home from work, thrilled to finally be off. It was all he could do not to call Cissie just to make sure she was still alive. He hoped Lachele had stayed out from behind the steering wheel, because that woman scared him. There was no telling what that crazy woman would do next. As he undressed for bed, he imagined what it would be like the following night, seeing Cissie lying in bed waiting for him. He imagined her in a white silk nightgown, her hair spilling over her shoulders. Nothing in life would please him more. He closed his eyes, pulling the covers over him. In less than 12 hours, he'd be standing at the front of the church, watching the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen walk down the aisle toward him. He was the luckiest man alive. He didn't know what he'd done to deserve her, but he hoped no one ever realized she was too good for him. Chapter 2. Cissie paced back and forth in the bride's room at the back of the church. "Is he here?" she asked Lachele. She was already dressed in her wedding dress, and instead of acting like a typical nervous bride, she was impatient. They could start without the last of the guests as long as the groom was there. She didn't care who missed the wedding. The only people that really mattered to her were already there. Yes, Samara is out there talking to him, trying to keep him calm. "I want to see him," Cissie demanded, reaching for the doorknob. Why did he need to be kept calm? Was he thinking of leaving? Lachele leaned against the door, preventing Cissie from opening it. "No. You know the rules. You'll see him when you're walking down the aisle and not a moment sooner." Cissie frowned. "We should have set the wedding for earlier. I want to see him." She stared down Lachele, determined to get the woman to talk. "You can at least tell me his name." "It's not like that's going to reveal anything." She had to know something. She was ready to get down on her knees, to get the older woman to throw her a bone. Lachele met Cissie's stare with a level look. "You may be taller than me, but I will take you down if you touch this door again." Cindy stood back watching them, ready to jump between the two high-strung women. "We don't need a knockdown drag-out fight between the matchmaker and the bride right before the wedding." She put her hand on Cissie's arm. "You need to go sit down and play a game on your phone. Crush some candy or something." She turned to Lachele. "Do not antagonize her. She's a little bit psycho about getting married, but I've never met a woman who wasn't." Lachele sighed. "I understand, but she's not seeing the groom yet. She agreed to my rules, and she's going to follow them." Cissie retreated to the corner and pulled out her phone, muttering under her breath. What would it hurt to see him? She'd be walking down the aisle in 15 minutes. She took deep breaths trying to calm down, but all she could think about was walking down the aisle to a man with no face. And what if he was blonde? She couldn't remember if she'd told Lachele not to find her a blonde. There was a knock at the door, and Cissie's parents rushed in. Cissie's dad looked nervous, but her mother had an extremely calm look on her face. Her dad walked to Cissie. "Anything I need to know before I take over for the week?" Cissie shrugged. "Not really. Everything's the same as it always is." "Well, that's not true. I have a new kid cooking in the kitchen. He's got the hots for Ashley, one of my bartenders. She's 10 years older than him and definitely not interested. Keep an eye on him." She hated passing off troubles to her dad, but she knew he could take care of it. She also knew he needed a distraction to keep him from worrying about her married to a virtual stranger. He nodded. "Will do." Looking his daughter up and down, he said, "You're just as beautiful as your mom was on her wedding day." Cissie smiled. "Thanks, Dad. I wish you were covered a bit more, but I guess that's the style these days." Cissie laughed. Her dress was perfectly modest. It was strapless, but there was no boobage hanging out. He should be pleased instead of complaining. "It is the style. You want me to look good for my husband, right?" He shook his head emphatically. No, I don't want you to look good for him. He might get ideas about my baby girl. You do know we're getting married, right? He's supposed to get ideas. If the man didn't get ideas, she was going to be sorely disappointed. His eyes narrowed. Not about my baby, he's not. He shook his head. Any grandkids need to either be immaculately conceived or adopted. That's my final offer. Cissie grinned, getting to her feet and hugging her dad. You know, I do know how to take care of myself. And she didn't really want kids right off anyway, so she didn't argue with him about his grandkids. I know you do. He sighed. I just hate the idea of my baby marrying some man I don't know. I'll be fine. Lachele made a good choice for Cindy. I'm sure she did just as good for me. Lachele stood up and walked over. I'll tell you, Mr. Rivers, I ran extra tests on this one. He's been forced through 4 more tests than any other man I set up. I just wanted to make sure he was the right man for our Cissie. She's too special to get the wrong man. Cissie frowned. You ran more tests than you did on Trey? Now why on earth would she do that? Lachele nodded. I did. I had to be sure. Was there something you were worried about? Cissie had no idea why her man would need more tests than any other, but it didn't sound good. His profession worried me a little. That's all. And what is his profession? Lachele laughed softly. I believe it's time for you to walk down the aisle. She took Cindy by the arm. You're first. I'm marrying him in 5 minutes. You can tell me his profession. Cissie couldn't believe how difficult Lachele was being. Lachele just waved over her shoulder as she left with her mother and Cindy. Cissie looked at her dad. Sometimes that woman makes me crazy. Her dad grinned. I can see why. Is she always like that? Cissie nodded. Pretty much. She took his arm. Thanks for giving me away, even though you have reservations. It means the world to me that you and Mom are here for this. She'd have married regardless, but she didn't tell him that. She knew whomever Lachele had chosen would be the perfect man for her. He leaned down and kissed her cheek. We wouldn't miss it for the world. As they walked out of the room to stand at the back of the church, she waited for the butterflies in her stomach, but they just didn't come. No, she was excited about her marriage, and she wasn't ashamed of it. They stepped through the doors at the back of the church. As her eyes zeroed in on her groom, she blinked. He looked so familiar to her, but she just couldn't place him. How on earth did she know the man? He was tall, dark, and handsome. Exactly what she was looking for. Her eyes swept down his body and back up. Oh yeah. She could jump his bones. No doubt about it. The man was hot, and he was about to be all hers. Bob's eyes locked onto Cissie as she floated into the sanctuary on her father's arm. His heart almost stopped. He'd never seen her hair down before, because she always had it in a ponytail, which made sense, because she was always serving food. Her usual wear for the bowling alley was a pair of jeans and a t-shirt, but there she was, looking like she'd just stepped out of the pages of a bridal magazine. He swallowed hard. He only hoped he could get his vows out. Her father placed her hand in his, and Bob realized he was shaking. Cissie must have noticed too, because she leaned close to him and whispered, "Don't be so nervous. I won't bite until we know each other a little better." To his embarrassment, Bob felt a blush spreading across his cheeks. What did this woman do to him that he could blush? Before he started going to the bowling alley to see her sing, he hadn't blushed since high school when he was caught making out with one of the cheerleaders under the bleachers during a football game. And he'd only blushed then, because he was caught by his algebra teacher, who he had a crush on. Of course, he was supposed to be on the field at the time. The preacher started speaking then, and he forced himself to concentrate, saying a silent prayer that he wouldn't stammer over his vows. Thankfully, he wasn't asked to repeat anything, and he managed, "I do." Cissie's voice rang out clear and strong when she said, "I do." And then the preacher invited him to kiss his bride. He turned to her fully, catching her waist with one hand and pulling her close. He lowered his head toward hers, and just as his lips were about to touch hers, she whispered, "It's our first kiss. Make me feel it in my toes." Bob grinned. This was the woman he needed for so many reasons. He lowered his head to hers, his heart feeling like it would pound out of his chest. He felt her lips part beneath his, and he took advantage, sweeping his tongue in to mate with hers. He wanted nothing more than to pick her up and carry her out of the church and take her home with him, but he couldn't. Her family and friends were watching, and he would do what he was supposed to do. When he lifted his head, her eyes were filled with passion. "Okay," he asked, thankful he got the word out. She nodded, staring into his eyes, before putting her hands behind his head and pulling him down for another kiss, much to the amusement of the congregation. When their lips finally parted, she whispered, "Very okay." Turning to face everyone, she heard the pastor say, "I'd like to present Mr. and Mrs. Robert Anderson." She leaned to him and whispered, "If we run for it, we can have a minute or two alone before anyone notices we're gone." And she desperately wanted that minute or two so they could talk and maybe kiss. She really wanted more kissing more than anything. He chuckled, gripping her hand tightly, as he began sprinting through the church to the bride's room at the back. Cissie locked the door and walked toward him, grabbing him for another kiss. Bob pulled her fully against him, kissing her like he'd wanted to kiss her in front of everyone. He pulled her hips flush with his and moved against her. Cissie pulled away from him, and for a moment he was worried he'd gone too far, but then she grinned at him. "You feeling frisky already? This is a good sign." She pulled him over to 2 chairs and sat in one. "So your name is Robert?" He nodded. "Bob." That had come out fine. Bob was thrilled. Maybe if he kept his answers succinct, he wouldn't stammer in front of her. He felt like his brain turned to mush as soon as she looked at him. "Bob, huh? I like that. Do you know that Bob spelled backwards is Bob?" She suppressed her giggle. Bob had always seemed like a funny name to her, though she wasn't sure why. He raised an eyebrow before nodding. What kind of question was that? Everyone knew Bob spelled backwards was still Bob. "Too bad my name isn't Anna. Then we'd both have names that would be the same forward as backward. Of course, then I'd feel like a character from Frozen, and I'm not about to share my sandwich with you." Bob hadn't seen Frozen, but he'd heard the song. "No?" he asked. He'd share anything with her. She shook her head, pulling his head down again. His taste was intoxicating. She hoped he was planning on driving wherever they were going, because with all the kissing they'd done, she wasn't sure she was up to it. Her knees were weak. "I took a week off work. Where are we spending the night?" She couldn't think of anything but being with him. That had to be a good sign, right? Bob swallowed hard. "My home." He was getting words out better than he'd thought he would. He just wished his palms would quit sweating and he wasn't shaking so much. "Where is home? Please tell me you're close." She knew she was being forward, but she didn't care. She was ready for her wedding night. She'd stayed a virgin, but just barely. She liked kissing and always had. In that way, she and Cindy were very different. Cindy had felt like it was a sin to kiss, but Cissie had considered kissing her due when she'd gone out on dates. She'd always stopped before she'd had sex, though. He nodded, his eyes on hers. "Shady Hills." He said, naming a town that was very close. "Oh, man. You're our football rival." She shook her head. "Please tell me you didn't go to high school there. How could she be married to a rival?" He shook his head. Chicago. We can go to football games and cheer for the Blevins Beavers then. Good. I was worried for a minute there. She grinned. We'd just better never watch the Bears play against the Packers. He grinned, cupping a hand over her cheek. He loved her hair down. She looked so different than she did at the bowling alley, but she was just as beautiful as ever. Sure. She turned her head and kissed his fingers. We need to go to the reception. My dad is going to give you the 3rd degree, I'm sure, but you can ignore him if you want. She looked at him, loving his brown eyes. What do you do for a living anyway? I'm a deputy sheriff. Her eyes grew wide. Wait a minute. That's why I recognize you. You pulled Lachele over for stupid driving last night. She giggled a little, wondering if he'd realized his future bride was in the truck. He nodded. Reckless. Well, her reckless driving was stupid. And that's why she told me my future husband wouldn't mind me drooling over the hot cop that pulled her over, and then laughed like a loon. She was so thankful to understand that. He really wasn't gay. Hot cop, he asked with a grin. He liked the idea that she'd been attracted to him the night before. Cissie nodded slowly. Very hot cop. She kissed him again, running her hand over the front of his jacket. Can't wait to see all of my hot cop. Bob laughed. He couldn't figure out why he'd been so nervous around her. His tongue was still thick, though, so he decided not to say anything else. He didn't want to scare her off yet. Of course, every word she said turned him on just a little bit more. It was like she could see what he wanted in a woman, and had the ability to become his dream girl. It was almost scary. Cissie jumped up. Let's go to the reception. The sooner we eat cake, the sooner we can get naked. Bob shook his head. He hadn't expected her to be so eager for her wedding night. In fact, he hadn't expected her to be willing to do anything yet at all. He wasn't going to complain though. He'd fantasized about making love to her, and he was ready for it to really happen. No, she asked, her hands on her hips. Are you denying me my conjugal rights? He'd better not be denying her anything yet. Bob laughed, pulling her to him for another kiss. Never. Glad to hear it. I'd have to fight you on that one. She unlocked the door and pulled him out of the room by his hand. Oh, hey, Dad. This is Bob. I like him. She almost added that she wanted to jump his bones, but she was certain that was something her father couldn't stand hearing. Her dad shook his head. Cissie, you're a little too bold sometimes. Cissie just shrugged. You've been saying that for years. She turned to Bob. This is my dad. He's responsible for my name. She rolled her eyes. Cissie is a perfectly respectable name, her dad protested. Maybe it is, until you tell the story of where you got it. Bob watched Cissie glare at her father, obviously waiting for him to tell the story, whatever it was. It was something they must have done hundreds of times over the years. There's nothing wrong with how you were named. Her dad looked at Bob. She was named after Loretta Lynn's daughter, Cissie Lynn. We like music in our house. Bob nodded. I like it. Of course, he liked everything about her, so her name was simply part of the overall package. He put his hand out to shake his new father-in-law's. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you too. What do you do for a living, Bob? He's a deputy sheriff. He pulled us over while we were out bachelorette partying last night. Do you believe? She giggled. I thought he was really cute even then. Her father had a new look of respect on his face. I feel like I'm leaving her in safe hands then. Bob nodded. You are, sir. No one would protect her like he would. Not even her father. Cissie turned to him with a grin, standing on tiptoe to kiss him. She heard her father sigh. I raised her to be less aggressive with men. Bob laughed. I like it. He wasn't about to complain about a beautiful woman kissing him. She grinned up at him. I think we're going to get along just fine, Deputy Bob. He cringed at the name. What was it about people calling him Deputy Bob all of a sudden? He hoped it wasn't becoming a trend. Asterisk. At the bowling alley, they ended up being pulled their separate ways, but Cissie kept her eyes on Bob. Who knew that a man so adorable was just the next town over? She'd have taken to speeding years ago if she'd known it would attract him to her. Cindy cornered Cissie when she finally paused for air. What do you think of him? He's sexy. Cissie grinned. Remember the hot cop from last night? And how Lachele hooted like a crazy woman when I said I probably shouldn't be lusting after him. She half expected Cindy to understand as soon as she asked the question, because Cindy had been reading her mind for years. Cindy nodded slowly. Yeah, but I didn't get a good look at him. You're welcome to look at him now. I call him husband. Cissie still couldn't believe she'd married the very man she'd been ogling unknowingly the night before. How much better could her life get? Cindy burst out laughing. Well, your new husband probably has no problem with you getting excited over the cop then. I can't believe you lucked out. You've always been a sucker for a man in uniform. I can't believe it. He's more than I dreamed he would be. And I've been dreaming of this day for a long time. Cissie needed to find Lachele soon and booby bump her. It was unbelievable just how happy she was at that moment. I'm so happy for you. So, you dragged him back to the bride's room. Is he a good kisser? Cissie fanned her face with her hand. Oh, yeah. I'm completely in lust with the man. I can't wait to strip him, use his cuffs on him, and ride him like a cowgirl. She bit her lip, looking around. Oh, good. You're the only one that heard that. She was so glad her parents weren't close enough to hear what she would have never told anyone but Cindy. Cindy laughed, holding her side. OMG, Cissie. He's not going to know what hit him. Cissie grinned. No, he's not. He's gotten a bit of a taste, but I was restrained considering we were in a church and all. She cocked an eyebrow. I wonder what he'd say if I dragged him off to my office and had my way with him. She was so tempted. If she hadn't been worried people would realize they were missing, she just might do it. I think you should keep restraining yourself until you're in a bed somewhere. It's your first time, and he's going to think you're a lot more experienced than you are. Cissie shrugged. I don't see how that could be a bad thing. Maybe we'll do the deed faster. I'm ready now. Have you seen him? If Cissie had been asked to create her dream man, it would have been Bob. Job and everything. He was perfect for her in every way. I have. He's pretty cute. He's not Trey, of course, but he's good for you. Cissie wanted to roll her eyes. Cindy's nerd had nothing on her cop, but she wasn't about to tell her friend that. You can have Trey if I can keep Bob. She looked at him across the crowded bowling alley, meeting his eyes. I need to go kiss him. Talk to you soon. Ignoring Cindy's laughter behind her, Cissie hurried across the bowling alley to where Bob was talking to a group of people. He was telling the story of pulling Lachele over the night before, and she stopped just behind him, listening to his perspective. I knew she was probably in the car, and I was almost afraid to say anything. Dr. Lachele is insane, but she wasn't drunk. I probably should have given her a ticket, but how could I with my bride right there in the car? Cissie stepped closer to Bob, her arm going around him as she gazed up at him. You could have actually. I wouldn't have freaked. Would have been a fun story. Bob looked down at her, blushing. What was it about this woman that made him blush every time she got close? His tongue felt thick in his mouth, and he knew he couldn't continue his story. Cissie stood on tiptoe and kissed him, her tongue quickly reaching out to rub his. "You're some kisser, Deputy Bob," she whispered, before disappearing again. As she walked away, his friend, Dave, started laughing. "You've got it bad. One word from her, and you're blushing like a girl." Bob glared at Dave. "I could still take you down, so don't push your luck." They both knew he spent a lot more time at the gym, keeping in shape than Dave did, and he knew Dave would back down. They all laughed, but Bob knew it was good-natured. Hopefully by the time he went back to work in a week, they'd have made love enough that he didn't act so silly every time she came around. Cissie rushed over to where her mother was putting out plates. "Are you just about ready to cut the cake?" she asked. "You don't have to do it yet, but from the way you two were just kissing, it looks like he's going to want to leave as soon as possible." "He's not the only one," Cissie muttered, thankful it was her mother making the observation and not her dad. Her mom shook her head. "Well, run over and get him, and you two can cut the cake. I think you need to stay for at least the first 5 dances, before you two take off." "Where are you going to be tonight?" "His house. He's a cop over in Shady Hills." "Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. Your father won't worry nearly as much knowing he carries a gun." Cissie shrugged. "Dad seems to like him." She looked over at Bob and saw him watching her again. She already felt like there was something special between them, and she meant for that to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. She and Deputy Bob were going to have a wonderful time. "I'm going to go get him." She hurried across the room and grabbed Bob's hand. "Sorry to drag him away, but my mother says it's time to cut the cake." She knew she should meet his friends, but right then all she could think about was going through the reception rituals so she could get it over with, and they could move on to the exciting part of the program, the wedding night. As they walked back toward the table where her mother had the cake set up, she whispered, "None of this shoving cake in each other's faces. I spent way too much on this dress for me to be willing to ruin it with stupidity." She wanted to save it for someone else to wear. If they never had a daughter, then one of Cindy's girls. She was sure her friend would have a half-dozen kids. "Okay," he said, blushing again. She was about to eat from his fingers. His heart was pounding madly at the mere idea. Why did everything about her seem so sexual to him? They got to the table, and she looked at her mother. "Mom, this is Bob." "Bob, this is my mom." Bob smiled at his new mother-in-law. "Nice to meet you." Mrs. Rivers smiled back. "Nice to meet you, too. Be good to her, and you'll never have problems with her father and me." He nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I'll treat her like the precious woman she is. That's all we ask." She handed Cissie the cake knife. "People are gathering and the photographer is ready." Cissie looked at Bob. "You have long arms. Just stand behind me and hold the weapon of cake destruction with both hands over mine." "The weapon of cake destruction?" Bob grinned, liking the idea of that. He had to press up against her back completely as he wrapped his arms around her, his hands over hers. "Like this?" he asked, brushing a kiss against her neck. It was all Cissie could do not to wiggle against him, but she really didn't think that would be playing fair. "Just like that. Ready?" "Oh, yeah." Cissie got the feeling he wasn't talking about being ready to cut the cake, and she knew she wasn't. It was nice to feel like they were of one mind. She moved the knife down and sliced through the cake, cutting off a small piece and putting it on a plate. She put the knife down and turned to him, reaching out for a small bite of the cake and waiting for him to do the same. She held the cake up to his lips, and he took it gracefully, the white of his teeth flashing. She opened her mouth for his bite, but made certain she nipped his finger just a little. Bob leaned close. "You're killing me," he whispered against her ear. "Nah," she whispered back. "I'm helping you know what you're in for. If you want to run, you'd better do it now." She knew some men were turned off by aggressive women, and if he was one of them, they were not meant to be. Never. She looked up at him with a huge smile on her face, stunned that she was actually married to this man. She was sure he had some faults somewhere, but so far, all she could find was a lovable man who seemed to think she was pretty darn special. What more could a woman ask for? Of course, he had a small bit of icing on his top lip, but that made him all the more adorable. She crooked her finger at him, to lean down just a bit, fully aware that there was still a crowd around them, and a photographer was ready to capture a picture. Bob leaned down, not sure what Cissie needed, but not really caring at that moment. She pulled his mouth the rest of the way to hers, making certain to lick every drop of frosting from his lip. Bob stroked her cheek softly. Can we go? He had to get her out of there and into his bed soon. He wasn't certain how much longer he could wait. Cissie's smile was bigger than ever. Mom says 5 dances. Can we start dancing now? Cissie laughed. My sentiments exactly. She looked at her mother, who was watching them with more amusement than reprimand. Can we do the first dance now? Her mother nodded. I'll go see to it. Cissie rested her hands gently on Bob's shoulders. I'd invite you into my office for a little alone time, but I think we should be in a bed for my first time. He kissed her forehead. Our first time together. He blushed again, but it was getting easier to talk to her at least. Maybe soon they'd be able to have an entire conversation. He was just glad she didn't seem to notice his short answers. Cissie made a mental note to bring up the topic again when they were alone in the car. Bob seemed really nervous already, and knowing he had a virgin bride on his hands just might send him over the edge. She'd rather be alone when that happened. The band started playing a slow song, and Cissie smiled. She'd almost forgotten she'd arranged to sing this first song to him while they danced. Taking his hand, she rushed over to the singer of the band, who gave her a mic to wear. When Bob saw the microphone, his eyes widened. He'd fallen in love with her the first time he heard her sing. Hearing her sing to him was going to be a true shock to his system, but it was obvious that she was about to do it. He pulled her into his arms in the center of the dance floor as the band started the song again, waiting as they began dancing. There was a crowd watching them around the edge of the dance floor as Cissie began singing. The words from "Could I Have This Dance" filled the building, but he knew they were just for him. From her. He knew the words, but he didn't feel like he should sing along. Her voice filled him with emotion. He only hoped someone was getting this moment on video, because he never wanted to forget it. He hadn't expected this song, but as wedding gifts went, it was at the top of his list. Chapter 3. Cissie had stashed her suitcase in her office, and they got it before going out to the car. It seemed like forever, and no time at all, before they were in Bob's Chevy Equinox and headed to his house. We'll have to get the rest of my clothes one day this week, but that's at least enough to last me a couple of days. Bob pulled out of the parking lot and pointed the car toward home. That works. He was more nervous again now that they were alone together. Cissie took a deep breath, knowing she needed to tell him what she'd meant about it being her first time. She wasn't looking forward to the conversation, but what the heck? He was always blushing, so she could just join him, right? I didn't mean that I wanted our first time together to be in a bed, she said softly. Bob looked at her with wide eyes. They could always put the back seat down. There wasn't a lot of room to stretch out, but he'd find an empty cornfield somewhere if that's what she wanted. Oh? Where then? Cissie stared at him for a moment, trying to understand him. When she comprehended how he'd taken her statement, she blushed and laughed at the same time. No, that's not what I mean either, but I do like the way you think, Deputy Bob. She needed to be clearer when she spoke to him apparently. His mind was definitely going to go where it wanted to go. Bob blushed, feeling like an idiot. What did you mean? I meant that this is my first time, not just our first time. She didn't look at him as she said the words. She couldn't, because now she was blushing too. What a pair they made. You mean, he couldn't force himself to finish the sentence. She couldn't mean what he thought she meant. She was too bold. She nodded. Exactly. I've never done this before. I'm a virgin. Totally new territory for me. She put her hand on his thigh and leaned close over the console. I find I'm a bit eager, though. It was the understatement of the year, but she couldn't very well tell him she wanted to strip him and do him in the car. Well, she could, but she probably shouldn't. Bob felt like his heart was going to beat out of his chest. He'd envisioned a long wild night of impassioned sex, and he was going to have to be gentle with her. He wanted to scream, and he was pleased all at once. No other man had touched her like he was going to. And never would. The drive to his house took 20 minutes, and he did his best to calm his beating heart. He knew she wasn't going to want to dive straight into bed when they got there, and it was all he could think about. They'd only had snacks at the reception, so he would probably need to come up with something for them to eat relatively quickly. He could get his mind out of his pants long enough to do that, couldn't he? When they pulled up in front of a small house in Shady Hills, she eyed it curiously. They were on the outskirts of town, not that there was much of a town there. Shady Hills had a population of less than 300 people, so it wasn't exactly overcrowded. They didn't even have their own bowling alley, and had to drive to Blevins to use theirs. Very sad in Cissie's mind. Of course, Blevins was dry and Shady Hills wasn't, so a lot of people in Blevins had to drive to Shady Hills to drink. Here, the bars were the centers of town. As soon as the car was stopped, she turned to him. You okay with what I told you? He'd said very little since she'd made her confession to him, and she was getting worried. Bob nodded solemnly, wondering what she'd say if he wasn't okay with it. Would she run out and take care of the problem with some stranger? He certainly couldn't allow that to happen. Reaching for him, she grabbed his shoulders and pulled him to her, her mouth going to his. She got caught by a cop kissing in a car as a teenager, and had always wondered about kissing a cop in a car. Maybe they could make out in the back of his police car sometime. Bob pulled her closer, groaning at the console digging into his side. We'd be a lot more comfortable in the house. In my bed. Only if you promise me one thing. He nipped her neck, ready to promise her anything in the world if she'd just go into the house and start stripping. What's that? Will you promise me that we'll make out in the back of your cop car someday? I have this thing about men in uniform, especially cops. She looked at him eagerly, hoping he'd agree. She knew she must seem crazy to him, but he wasn't complaining, so she didn't care. Bob felt the laughter bubble up inside him. She really was something else. Sure. I'll do anything as long as we're in the house and naked in less than 5 minutes. He blushed as he said the words, but at least his tongue didn't feel too thick to speak for once. I bet I can be undressed before you, she said, opening her car door. Want a race? Depends on what the winner gets. She thought about that for a moment as she rushed toward the door, tapping her foot impatiently as he grabbed her suitcase from the back. Loser has to cook every meal all week. Cissie hated cooking. She was good at it, because she needed to be for her work, but she didn't have any desire to do it at home. Hopefully he, by some magic, loved to cook and wouldn't mind doing it every day. Bob set the suitcase down on the porch as he unlocked his door. Sure. I like to cook. Lead the way to my honeymoon suite, she said, standing just inside the door, looking around. He needed some serious help in the interior decorating department. His house looked like he'd purchased whatever garage sale finds were available on any given day. Bob pushed past her and walked down the hallway to his bedroom, having no doubt she'd follow. His sweet little virgin bride was eager for him, and he couldn't be happier about it. He pushed open the door to his bedroom, looking around with fresh eyes, trying to see it as she would. His bedspread was dark and manly, not something a woman would like much. But he'd sprinkled pink rose petals all over the bed that morning, thinking she'd like it. Now, looking at them, he blushed, thinking it had been a mistake. Cissie looked at the bed, a grin lighting up her face. Ah. Rose petals? You're the best, Deputy Bob. She turned her back to him, pulling her long dark hair out of the way. Unzip, please. I can't reach. She was determined to be undressed before him. Bob placed a kiss on the side of her neck, before his hands moved to her zipper. I could just let you stand there, forcing you to lose. She glanced over her shoulder at him. But you won't, because you want me naked. She had no doubt about the power she had over him. He laughed. I do. We don't need more wedding bells now. Just get me out of this thing. He quickly unzipped her and watched as she pushed the dress down around her waist without even looking at him. She wore a corset under the dress because she hadn't been able to find a strapless bra she liked. She had stockings on, instead of nylons, that attached to the corset. He'd never seen a sexier outfit in his life. She turned to face him, noting that he was standing still watching her undress. She started to say something, but she wasn't going to ruin a week of him cooking. Do you want to untie my corset for me? She asked sweetly. I can do it, but it's so much easier with help. Bob nodded, not trusting his voice. Turn around. After she'd complied, he untied her corset, loosening it for her. He didn't wait to be asked to unsnap the stockings, simply going to his knees to take care of that for her. When he was finished, he tugged her corset down to her feet so she could step out of it. Wow. She grinned down at him, cupping her breasts in her hands as if offering them to him. Wow. He wasn't the most eloquent man she'd ever met, but what he did say, he made special. He slowly got to his feet, his gaze going from her head to her toes. She wore only her white panties and the stockings, which were still all the way up her thighs. You look incredible. He pushed her gently back toward the bed. Sit down. I'll get your stockings and shoes off. Cissie watched him kneel at her feet again, sliding each of her shoes off before he carefully rolled her stockings down her legs and off her feet. When he'd put the second stocking on the floor, he lifted her bare foot to his mouth, kissing her arch. Looks like I only have one thing left on me, and you're still fully clothed. Cissie took her other foot and moved it inside his suit jacket, feeling his muscles against her toes. You had help, he protested. She got to her feet and waited for him to do the same. Well, let me remove this last thing to clinch the win, and then I'll help you. She didn't care if she'd cheated or not. She wasn't going to have to cook for a week, and she'd take the victory and run with it. He watched as she shimmied out of her panties, standing before him totally nude. He liked her boldness and found himself falling for her more than ever. I already said wow. How about, you're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen, and I can't believe you're mine. She laughed softly. That'll do. Reaching out, she pushed his jacket off his shoulders. I love how broad your shoulders are. I'm a sucker for a man with strong muscles and a uniform. Someday we're going to have to play cop and prisoner, but I want handcuffs lined with fur. She wiggled her eyebrows at him. You are going to be a handful, Cissie Anderson. Did you ever doubt it? It seemed strange to hear him call her that, but she didn't take time to think about it. Instead, she untied his tie and slipped it out of the collar of his shirt, dropping it on the floor. She'd find a way to convince him it was his job to pick it up later. She had won after all. He shook his head. No, he'd never doubted it. He'd known from the first time he heard her sing that she was full of passion and life. Holding on to her and clinging as long as he could was his only real option. He needed her in more ways than he could possibly count. She swiftly unbuttoned his shirt, pushing it off his shoulders. Taking a step back, she admired what she'd uncovered. He had a light spattering of dark chest hair, just enough that she wanted to run her fingers through it, so she reached out a hand and touched. What will that feel like against my breasts? Not one given to wondering about anything for long if she could get an answer, she stepped closer to him and pressed against him, wiggling a little to feel the hair tickle her. I like. Bob couldn't help but admire the way she took what she wanted. He wondered what she'd do if he threw her down on the bed and stripped off his pants. He took a deep breath to calm himself. Slow and steady. Cissie made a face. You need to sit down. I have to take your shoes and socks off now, 'cause I'm not waiting to take your pants off, and you'll look silly with your socks on and no pants. She'd seen men in movies in their socks and underwear, and it always made her laugh. She did not want to be laughing at her sexy husband on their wedding night. Bob couldn't help but chuckle. Are you ever afraid to just take what you want? Cissie shrugged. No one is going to hand me the world on a silver platter. If I want something, it's my job to get it. She didn't want things to be handed to her. She liked being independent and getting what she wanted when she wanted it. Cindy called her a control freak, but really? She just knew what she wanted and how she wanted it. Why did that make her a freak? I'd give you the world if I could. His words were simple, but he hoped she knew how heartfelt they were. She smiled. He already acted like he was in love, but she knew that wasn't possible. Someday soon, she hoped. While he sat, she knelt at his feet and removed his socks and shoes. Now stand back up, because these things are coming off. Her hands gripped the fabric of his pants, leaving no doubt in his mind what she was talking about. Bob stood and watched her as she quickly undid the fly of his pants, pushing them down to the floor. She sighed when they were off. What's that about? I was worried you'd wear tidy whities, and the whole thing would be ruined. Cindy had said Trey had been wearing tidy whites on her wedding day, and all day she'd worried that Bob was wearing them. He threw back his head and laughed. I need you in my life. Her eyes were filled with laughter as they met his. Yes, you do. Everyone does. She slipped her hands in his boxers and over his butt, stroking it. Nice tushy, Deputy Bob. Bob blushed, shaking his head. I don't think you're supposed to be quite this eager. Cissie shrugged. I can't remember the last time I did something just because I was supposed to. She pushed his boxers down, looking at what she'd uncovered. She touched his erection, surprised at the feel. She'd done a lot of making out with boys between high school and college, but she'd never gone so far as to actually touch a man there. Bob caught her hand and moved it away. Not yet, he whispered. Cissie looked at him in surprise. You don't like it? In the romance novels, the men had always loved it, but romance novels weren't always right. He lowered his head to hers, kissing her, nibbling at her lips. I like it too much. I don't want this to be over before it starts. She grinned. I don't either. She pushed him toward the bed, surprised that she wasn't nervous now that the time was upon them. She wasn't, though. She couldn't wait to touch him all over. Bob wasn't a stupid man, and he could take a hint. He stretched out on his back on the bed, watching Cissie crawl toward him. She knelt beside him on the bed, stroking his chest, her eyes looking at his manhood. Are you sure I can't touch it? She really wanted to touch him. Surely he'd change his mind. Not this time. Sorry. He hated denying her anything, but he just didn't have the kind of control he'd need for that. He'd dreamed of having her in his bed for so long, that now she was actually there, he wasn't sure how he was going to keep from exploding too soon. Cissie frowned. She wanted to play with it, but if he wasn't ready for that, then she could just get on with it. She put one knee over him, straddling his middle. Her hands were on either side of his head as she leaned down to kiss him. "I think I like you, Deputy Bob," he groaned, cupping her breast in his hand. "You're killing me." He didn't know if she was on him just for the closer contact, or if she actually expected to ride him. For a virgin, she was one forward woman. He liked that about her, but was certain she'd really kill him when she was more experienced. Cissie lifted her hips and moved so she was hovering over him, pressing down so she could feel him against her opening. She let out a soft moan. "Help me here. It's not like I know what I'm doing." Bob didn't know whether to laugh or not, so in the end he did as she asked. He guided himself to her tight channel, putting his hands on her hips and pushing up at the same time. Cissie gasped as she felt him slip inside her, just a little. She knew there would be pain involved, but she also knew the pain was in the way of her pleasure, so she pressed her lips to his before pushing down, letting gravity help her. Bob swallowed her gasp of pain, wrapping his arms around her, holding her still for a moment. "I was going to go slow," he protested, worried he'd hurt her. "Why?" "It was going to hurt either way. Rip the Band-Aid off fast and get to the good stuff." She wiggled a little, feeling her breasts brush his chest hair. He stroked his hands up and down her back, knowing she needed a minute. All his instincts were screaming at him to start moving within her, but he just couldn't hurt her that way. No, she needed him to be gentle. Cissie sighed, wiggling her hips a little, enjoying the feel now. "Okay, I'm ready." She pushed herself up to a sitting position facing him, feeling him deeper inside her than before. "Let's do this thing." He chuckled, shaking under her. Cissie let out a small moan. "That felt good. Laugh some more." Bob just shook his head, knowing she could figure it out herself. Cissie began to slowly rock over him, feeling him pulse inside her. It was such a strange sensation, but she liked it. It only took her a moment to get the hang of what she was supposed to do, and she was soon moving them toward their pleasure. He played with her breasts, his thumbs rubbing her nipples. Watching her face as she moved, and grew used to him, was almost as pleasurable as the act itself. She hid nothing, everything she was feeling out in the open. When she climaxed, he pulled her head down for his kiss, before rolling them over so he could finish quickly. A few minutes later, they were laying on their sides facing one another, and he was stroking her hair out of her face as his breathing slowly returned to normal. "I thought you'd make me wait for a wedding night," he said softly. Cissie laughed. "I've waited my whole life to make love. I'm married, and it's going to happen. Often." She kissed him quickly. "But now I'm hungry, and someone is supposed to be cooking for me." She should be less forceful in her words, but really, she wanted to start their marriage the way she meant to go forward. He groaned. "Are you always going to be this demanding?" She shook her head. "No, but I think I need to keep my energy up if we're going to do this more tonight." And they were going to do it a lot more that night. She was determined. He laughed. "We'll see how you feel after we eat. I don't want you to get sore. My parents always taught me that I was only hurting myself if I broke my toys." She giggled. "Is that all I am to you? A toy? A plaything?" She loved the idea of being his playground. He cupped her face in his hands, looking deeply into her green eyes. "No, you're so much more than that. You're my wife, the woman I'm spending the rest of my life with. And you are the most amazing woman I've ever met." She sighed, her hand tracing his jaw. "I could get used to having a man say things like that to me. Usually they say, 'Cissie, are you crazy?' I like what you say better. Say some more." He just laughed, holding her close. "Can we nap for a few minutes before I cook?" "Sure, but the playground is closed until you feed me, Deputy Bob." Her eyelids were already fluttering closed. A nap sounded good. She could wait to eat for a little while at least. You know, you could just call me Bob if you wanted. Deputy Bob feels so formal. Cissie considered that for a moment. I guess I could do that. Can I call you Deputy Bob when we play warden and prisoner, though? Bob just laughed. Could I stop you? Asterisk. Bob woke feeling something heavy on his shoulder. He was startled at first, and then he saw Cissie's head on his shoulder. Her face was toward him, and she looked so peaceful and innocent in her sleep. He was thrilled to have the opportunity to just look at her, without her being aware. Truly, he'd expected her to be disappointed when she saw him at the church, but her enthusiasm had been overwhelming. He couldn't help but wonder if he'd asked her out at the bowling alley if she'd have said yes. He wasn't about to ask, though. Lachele had been insistent that he wait a while before telling her he'd engineered the whole match, convinced that she'd be angry if she found out the truth. He watched her slowly wake up, her green eyes confused for a moment, but then a slow grin spread across her face. Bob, she said with a sigh. He cupped her cheek with his hand. How are you doing? He asked. He was thrilled she was happy to see him, and her emotions were right there on her face, easily readable. Hungry. Cissie could hear her stomach growling. She'd eaten almost nothing that day. She hadn't felt nervous, but her appetite had been gone. He laughed. I couldn't get up to fix something because you were using my shoulder as a pillow. You looked so beautiful. I just couldn't disturb you. And it was true as far as it went. Of course, he hadn't wanted to move away from her. Holding her while she slept had been the most wonderful thing he'd done in a long time. Excuses, excuses. Kiss me, and then go cook, and I will lie abed like a princess waiting to be served by her minion. She couldn't remember ever waking up and feeling quite so content. If he'd just feed her, everything would be right with the world. Bob sighed. Now I understand why you wanted a husband. You needed a lackey to carry out your every wish. Not that he minded. He'd gotten the world when he married her. It was the least he could do to give it back to her. I'm so glad you understand without me having to spell it out. He kissed her and gave her bottom a playful swat. You could at least set the table while I cook. He expected her to have a reason she couldn't do that, so he waited for it. She nodded. Oh, I could. I think I'll shower instead. He rolled out of bed grumbling good-naturedly. He truly didn't mind cooking for her while she showered, but he didn't want her to think she could run all over him either. Tacos or omelets, he asked, thinking about what he had in the kitchen. They would probably need to run to the grocery store within the next day or so to get more food if they were going to eat at home a lot. Cissie considered his question for a moment. Omelets, I think. She got up and walked toward the bathroom, not self-conscious about her nudity at all. He caught her as she was about to pass him, kissing her again. We need to keep your strength up, he said with a wink. She laughed. And yours. You're going to need lots of stamina. She closed the bathroom door with a snap, turning on the water as she looked in the mirror. Her hair was sticking up all over, but he'd still thought she looked good apparently. He was one crazy man. Chapter 4. While Cissie showered, she sang, her tunes excited and upbeat. She wrapped a towel around her body sarong style, before heading back into the bedroom to get some clothes from her suitcase. She and Cindy had done some lingerie shopping, and she pulled out a short green satin nightgown with spaghetti straps. It came to the top of her thighs, and she knew it would drive Bob crazy. Of course, everything she did seemed to drive Bob crazy. Bob was wonderful. Pulling it over her head, she put on a silky robe that came to her knees over the top. She'd take it off after dinner, and he wouldn't know what hit him. Cissie had always known that she was attractive to a lot of men, but Bob took it to the next level. He all but worshipped her with his eyes. It was wonderful, and she was thrilled he'd been chosen for her. She walked into the kitchen, and sat in a chair to watch him cook. He'd pulled on a pair of boxers, but nothing else, and she admired his lean, muscled body. She let out a low whistle, and he turned, blushing. "I like it when you blush," she said softly. It happened often, and she hoped he never stopped. He shook his head. "I'm a 33-year-old cop. I shouldn't be blushing at anything. What is it about you that makes me blush?" He still couldn't figure out just what it was that was so special about Cissie to him. It wasn't just her appearance. It was so much more than that. She shrugged. "Maybe it's because you know that I'm mentally stripping you while you make me an omelet?" Her eyes were full of laughter as he blushed a shade darker. "If I didn't before, I do now. Please, continue to see me as a sex object. I beg of you." Cissie grinned at him. "If you insist." "Oh, I definitely do." He put her omelet on a plate and added 2 pieces of buttered toast. "I haven't figured out the trick for making 2 at once, so I'll make mine and be right there." She looked down at the perfectly cooked omelet and smiled. "This looks delicious." Of course, she was at a point in her life where she'd happily eat anything she hadn't had to cook herself. "It is." He was confident about his cooking. When he'd been engaged to Tanya, he'd done all the cooking, and she hadn't complained once. And Tanya complained about everything. Every time they'd gone out to eat, she'd sent her food back for one reason or another. She hadn't been a pleasant person to be around. She cut into her omelet with her fork, watching the cheese drip out of it. Popping the bite into her mouth, she smiled and nodded. "This is good. Oh, you have just earned the right to cook for me for the rest of my life." Her words were spoken with all the enthusiasm of a game show host telling a contestant what he had won. Bob laughed. "We may have to take turns some. I do have a pretty demanding job." Cissie shrugged. "So do I. I put in at least 50 hours per week." If they were going to play the demanding job game over who cooked, she'd happily get her vocation addressed immediately. "We're going to have to figure out how to make things work then. Do you want me to try to get a later shift? You don't work nights? Why were you the one pulling us over last night then?" He sat down across from her with his own omelet. "I worked a double shift yesterday so that we could have a full week without me working. I'm glad you arranged to have the week off, too. I can't imagine having to go to work the day after I get married like Cindy had to." She shook her head. She wanted to be able to drag him off to the bedroom anytime she felt like it without work interfering at all. "And Cindy is?" He knew the answer, but he also knew he wasn't supposed to know it, so he pretended not to. "Cindy's my best friend since kindergarten. Lachele matched her up a few months ago with a nerd from Texas named Trey. He's awesome." "And she had to work the next day?" Bob suddenly felt sorry for Trey. Cissie nodded. "She runs a bed and breakfast in Blevins. Both of us wanted to get out of Wisconsin when we graduated from high school, and we both ended up back there, living other people's dreams." She shrugged. "Nothing ever is exactly like you expect, is it?" He shook his head. "No, it's not. Do you like managing the bowling alley?" She seemed to him like the type who would be on the road, singing and working toward her music career. He couldn't imagine her in a bowling alley for the rest of her life. "Sometimes. I mean, I like being my own boss. Don't get me wrong. When it comes down to it, though, it's a job like any other. I have a little control, but I'm still really having to answer to my parents, who own the place." "Are you unhappy?" he asked, frowning at her. Cissie shook her head. "I believe you make your own happiness. If you're doing a job you hate, you can still be happy. It's harder, but you can do it. I don't hate my job. I just don't always love it. At one point, I thought I'd sing professionally, but instead I'm managing a bowling alley." I'd never make it if not for Wednesday nights. Karaoke nights kept her going in so many ways. Her dad had been against the idea, but he'd known he'd lose her without it. Wednesday nights? He felt like a fraud. He so badly wanted to tell her that he'd heard her sing and had fallen in love with her. Lachele knew her best, though. We do karaoke every Wednesday. It's something I added when I took over, because I needed to be able to sing sometimes. She shrugged as if it was no big deal, but it was extremely important to her. You have a beautiful voice. Hearing you sing today sent shivers up my spine. And other places too, but he wasn't going to tell her that. Not on their wedding day. She'd figure it out on her own as time went by. Cissie winked at him. I was hoping to get you somewhere else. Bob blushed, wishing with everything inside him he could stop doing that. You know, I don't think I'd blushed once in 15 years before I met you. Now it's hourly. Cissie laughed. You'll get used to me. She stood up and started washing the dishes for him. It was only fair she do them since he'd cooked. He watched her bustling around, clearing off the table. You don't have to do that. I can. He felt like he should wait on her. She gave him so much, just by being her. How could he ask her to do something as mundane as dishes? You cooked. I can wash the dishes. Do you like your job? She asked. She'd do dishes every single day for the rest of her life if it meant she only had to cook when she felt like cooking. Most of the time. I'm definitely happier here than I was in Chicago. When he'd started out, he'd been certain that being a cop in a big city was the way to make a difference in the world. It hadn't taken long for life to break him of that belief. You were a cop in Chicago? She asked. For how long? She was surprised to hear that. Why would someone go from the big city to small town Wisconsin? It didn't make sense to her. 10 years, he said, wishing he hadn't gone down that road. He wasn't ready to talk about Chicago yet. I've been here for 2 years. Wow. 12 years as a cop. That's a long time. She couldn't imagine doing that difficult of a job day in and day out for 12 years. She knew herself well enough to know she couldn't handle it for more than a day or two. He nodded. I started straight out of college. I got a degree in criminal justice first. I was sure I'd change the world. Are you disappointed? What made you move here from Chicago? Disappointed, no. I think everyone has high expectations of what they can do when they graduate from college. When he said nothing else, she turned to him, leaning against the counter. And why did you leave Chicago? He frowned at her question, trying to put into words how he'd felt when he left, without revealing too much. Chicago wasn't a place where I felt I could make a difference. The violence was everywhere. One cop couldn't make any clear-cut changes in the way things were. It's different here. Life is simpler. There are no gang fights. We don't find children in dumpsters in the back of alleys. He shrugged. I needed to be somewhere I felt I was needed and I could make a difference. Chicago wasn't that place. It sounds like you've got some stories to tell, she said softly, wishing she hadn't asked the question that filled his voice with sadness. They were supposed to be happy. It was still their wedding day after all. She moved behind him and put her hands on his shoulders, rubbing the tension from them. I'm here to listen when you're ready to talk about whatever happened. Until then, I'm here to make you forget. She dropped a kiss on top of his head. You know, the only plate left is the one you're eating off of. If you'll give it to me, maybe we could go snuggle on the couch and make out or something. He laughed. Make out, huh? Is that all you think about? He hoped Cissie was always of the attitude that everything could be made better with sex. It worked for him. I've been married about 7 hours now, to a man I think has got to be one of the sexiest men alive. I saw you last night and thought about calling the wedding off and following you." She took his plate and fork and put them into the dishwasher. "You said you didn't mind being my sex object." Bob was thankful she'd changed the subject so easily. He didn't want to talk about what happened in Chicago yet. He wanted to spend time with her and soak in her joy in living. "Sure, let's go make out on the couch." He let her precede him from the room, watching the way her robe swayed around her hips. Did she have anything on under that robe? He couldn't tell, but he sure wanted to find out. "Are you wearing anything under your robe?" "Maybe." She looked over her shoulder at him, giving him a look that made him want to skip the couch and drag her straight off to bed. He sat on the couch, and she sat beside him, as close to him as she could get without being on his lap. He slipped his arm around her shoulders and hugged her to him. "So what do you want to do this week while we're both off work?" She shrugged. "We could always go to the Dells. Maybe take one of the boat tours or a duck tour. I'm not sure if the duck tours are open this late in the year, but I know the boats are open till the end of October. Cindy and I thought about going last year, but we didn't think about it till the middle of November when it was too late. We could do that. We need to get some groceries. I didn't have time because I did several doubles this past week." He stroked his hand over her arm. "And we probably need to go get your clothes from your house. Are you living here with me?" We never even talked about that. It was weird sitting with his new bride, unsure of where they'd live. Nothing seemed to matter as long as she was with him, though. "I live with my parents. They're gone half the year, doing their traveling thing, so I stay in their house. Easier for everyone involved. So yes, I'm living here with you." She nipped at his neck. "If you'll have me, that is." It was a good thing he didn't have a roommate, because she was moving in with him no matter what. She didn't have a suitable place for them. He turned to her on the couch, his lips meeting hers. "I can't think of anyone I'd rather have as a roommate." "Roommate?" she asked. "Hey, married people have to learn how to live with each other, just like roommates do. But I plan on you being my roommate with benefits." She put her palms flat on his chest, stroking him. "What kind of benefits?" she asked, just to see if she could make him blush again. He chuckled, sliding his hand into her open robe. "Why don't we figure that out as we go along?" His hand encountered the silky fabric of her nightgown and he frowned. "You are wearing something under there." He had truly expected her to be naked under the robe, and found he was a little let down that she wasn't. She laughed. "I never said I wasn't." She got to her feet and untied the robe, watching his face as she slowly dropped it to the floor. Bob took a gulping breath, staring at her in the nightgown. It was obvious she had nothing on under it, and it stopped at the top of her thighs. He could see her hard nipples against the fabric. "You are so beautiful." She smiled, completely uninhibited in front of him. Taking a step toward him, she was unsure of whether he would want to pull her into his lap or go to bed. After one indecisive moment, she made the decision herself. She wanted to sit on his lap and toy with him for a minute, so that's what she'd do. He watched as she climbed onto his lap, straddling him, her hands on his bare shoulders. Her gown immediately bunched up and the only thing separating them was the thin fabric of his boxers. "I've got you now," she said, her tone intimidating. He laughed. "You do? What are you going to do with me?" "I hadn't thought that far ahead," she admitted with a grin. "What do you want me to do with you?" "Oh, I think the answer to that is pretty obvious." He pulled her hips flush against his, so she could feel his hard ridge against her softest parts. "Oh," she said, as if just then comprehending. "We could do that." She pressed her lips to his, thankful he let her toy with him and play with him that way. She couldn't imagine being married to a man who took himself seriously. She rubbed herself against him, and he groaned softly. "You know, I think we need to adjourn this to the bedroom." It's my turn to be on top. He guided her to her feet before standing up and pulling her against him. I get turns too. She pouted at him. But I liked being on top. He scooped her up into his arms and carried her to their bedroom, laying her on the bed. You'll like this, too, he promised. Asterisk. At breakfast the next morning, Bob suggested they go ahead and get her things moved into his house, so she would feel more at home. Really, he wanted to be surrounded by her things. He wanted to feel like her presence and very existence was interwoven with his. Cissie readily agreed. We should probably see if we can borrow Trey's truck. Trey too, for that matter. You don't think he'll mind? As long as we don't let Lachele drive it, he won't care at all. She grinned at him. Did you know Lachele was a bad driver when you got in a car with her behind the wheel on Friday night? He'd truly never seen anyone swerve like Lachele had without at least a six-pack of beer in their system. Cissie nodded. Oh yeah. The stories her husband tells would turn your hair gray. And she backed into a dock with me in the boat when she interviewed me, repeatedly. Bob blinked a few times, trying to understand her reasoning. So why did you get in a car with her? Cissie shrugged. I guess I didn't think she'd be that bad on the road. I was wrong. And no one else wanted to drive. Lachele wanted to. Please promise me you won't ever do anything that crazy again. I thought she was driving drunk when I saw the vehicle swerving in and out. I promise, all any of us drank all night was pop. She understood where he was coming from, and she knew they'd all shown poor judgment getting into the car with her. That doesn't make me feel any better. He rubbed his hands through his hair. Do you have any idea how many people I've pulled out of wrecked cars? How many families I've had to visit to explain that their loved one was never coming home? I can't lose you, Cissie. His voice was desperate, and he didn't care. He wouldn't lose another person he loved. Cissie walked to him, wrapping her arms around him. I won't ride with her again. I promise. She rested her head against his chest, surprised at how upset he was, but happy to agree if it made him happy. Who have you lost? Bob closed his eyes. My parents were hit by a drunk driver when I was in college. They both lived, but Mom was in a wheelchair for a while. That's why they didn't come to the wedding. It's hard for her to ride in a car now. She's afraid to be in a car at all. He'd changed his major to criminal justice just a few weeks later. She was certain his parents' wreck hadn't been the panic she heard in his voice. But who did you lose? He sighed heavily. My partner. She did something foolhardy, and I watched her die. I let her die. Will you tell me about it? It was obviously something that had made a big difference in his life, and she wanted to hear about it. She wanted to know everything about him. Bob was tempted to talk about Sinead to her, but he just couldn't. He didn't want her to realize it was his fault his partner had died. It was enough that he blamed himself. Someday. He hadn't talked about it since he'd had to spend hours with the department shrink. Cissie sighed, wishing he'd talk about what happened. How could she be a loving, supportive wife if he wouldn't tell her anything? I'll be ready to listen. Bob smiled at her words. Thanks. Do you have Trey's number? He had to change the subject before he broke down and told her everything. It was too soon for her to know. The contract she'd signed was only in effect for a year. After that, she was able to leave. She shook her head. No, but I have Cindy's. Want me to text her? That'd be great. He had Trey's number, but he didn't want to give that fact away. He couldn't help but wonder how his sweet wife would respond if she knew how their wedding had really come to be. She grabbed her phone and typed a quick text. Made it through the wedding night. Awesome. Can we borrow Trey's truck? It was cryptic, but Cindy would understand. She and Cindy had been sharing a brain for 20 years. Looking up at Bob, she said, I texted her. It might take a minute for her to respond, because she's busy in the mornings. By noon, they not only had Trey's truck, they had Cindy and Trey helping them. Trey and Bob were riding together, and Cissie and Cindy were following in Bob's Equinox. So? What do you think of your Bob? Cindy asked as they drove toward Cissie's parents' house. Bob is special. I like him a lot, and he seems to almost worship me, which I like, because he does it in a totally non-creepy way. He's hiding something, though. Maybe more than one something. She shook her head. She believed in full truth at all times. In fact, she often shared a great deal more truth than people wanted to know. How do you know? Well, he said something about a former partner who died in front of him, and he was obviously sad about it. I asked him to tell me about her, but he wouldn't. He said he would someday. Cissie made a face. She hated waiting for someday. Oh, he doesn't realize that you hate secrets, does he? It's like Trey with my coffee mug when we first married. I thought I was going to have to hit him over the head with a baseball bat. Cissie laughed. He doesn't know much about me at all yet. We haven't been married for 24 hours yet. Sex was good? Cindy asked. Cissie rolled her eyes. Sex was amazing. Do you really think I'd tolerate anything less? Cindy had known her too long not to know she'd make sure it was good, no matter what it took. Cindy chuckled. I can just see you getting sex books from the library and showing him exactly how to do it right. If I needed to, I certainly would. Sex is too much a part of married life for me to put up with it being subpar. So far so good, though. I like him. He seems very likable, Cindy responded. We've both taken the week off work, but we're not really going anywhere for a honeymoon. We need to get to know each other better, though. I wish Trey and I could have done that. I just couldn't see closing the band bee in the middle of summer, though. It's our busy season. Cindy shrugged. We made it work. You did, and you had a psycho sister-in-law flying at you. Penny was a real piece of work, Cindy said, shaking her head. She's doing well in counseling, according to Trey's dad. Have you met his parents yet? No. They're supposed to fly up for Christmas, though. I hope I can handle them. Cissie understood immediately what Cindy meant. Her mother-in-law had defended Penny to no end, and there was bound to be some friction there. Let me know if you have problems. I'll borrow Bob's nightstick and take them out. Cindy laughed. I can just picture you going after my in-laws with a nightstick. Sometimes you're scary, Cissie. I'm glad you're always on my side. The best part of that is I always will be. Cissie laughed at a memory. Do you remember when we were 7, and we wanted to become blood sisters like some of the boys at school were doing, but we were afraid to cut ourselves? Cindy nodded. So you came up with the idea of spitting on dirt and shaking hands that way. And you decided that blood sisters was boring. Instead, we'd be dirt sisters. Yes. And we will always be dirt sisters, Cindy. No matter what. They pulled up in front of the house and went inside to get what Cissie needed. I've already got most of it packed up and ready to go. She led the way up to her bedroom and pointed out the boxes she needed moved first. Trey picked up the first box. What have you got in here? Rocks? Cissie shook her head. Books. I mostly read on my Kindle, but those are books that I've had autographed by favorite authors. Trey looked at the 5 boxes of books. You've had that many books autographed? How did you meet that many authors? Online. Cindy and I are both part of some Facebook groups with some authors. We help them, and they send us books. Everyone's happy. Trey looked at Cindy. Why didn't I know this? Cindy shrugged. I read a lot. The men carried out the boxes, while Cissie and Cindy carried the hanging clothes. Trey grumbled about the books every time they passed him, but Bob just took it in stride. Cissie overheard Bob say to Trey, "If these boxes are giving you trouble, maybe you should start working out." She hurried past too quickly to hear Trey's response, but she couldn't let her friend's husband hear her laugh, and she was about to explode. She was leaned into the back of the Equinox laughing when Cindy came up behind her. "What's so funny?" Cissie explained what she'd heard, and Cindy covered her mouth to stifle her own giggle. "Trey's not a gym rat like Bob, but he's strong." "I know. I just thought it was hilarious." Cissie watched their husbands walking toward them. Bob was wearing shorts and a tight-fitting t-shirt. "I do like the way my new husband fills out his clothes." Cindy nodded, watching them. "Maybe we should suggest they take off their shirts, because it's so hot. It's 55 degrees out." Neither of them would believe that was why. "If we were moving in summer, maybe. Besides, you don't need to be ogling Bob." "You love Trey." "I do. But Bob is serious eye candy." Both women were laughing as they walked past the men to go back into the house.